Today's daf is daf Chaf Dalid, and we'll begin here on Chaf Gimel Amid Beis with Tashma. So you'll see the wide lines. It's the third of the wide lines, or if you're counting from the bottom of the Amid, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines up from the bottom. Now, we're going to continue with the question of min b'mino. We said that according to Rabbi Yehuda, min b'mino, a mixture of two things that are like one another, the same type, it's not batel. There's no din of bittel. And that's going to come up in a discussion with regard to a mixture of basar shchuta with basar nevela, whereas the latter, nevela, is mitame, and the question is whether we could apply bittel. And we have here a machlokes between Rav Chanina and Rav Chizda how to understand the shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Let's keep in mind that Rabbi Yehuda derives his conclusion from the mixture on Yom Kippur of dam hapar with dam hasair. When the dam hapar is greater in volume than the dam hasair, and nevertheless the Torah considers it as if he's doing the hazaya after this mixture of the dam hasair. And Rabbi Yehuda derives the conclusion from that dam and dam is min b'mino, and there's no bittul with min b'mino. The Chacham reject that. They have a different interpretation about olim lemizbeach. And now we have a machlokes between Rabbi Chanina and Rav Chizda as to how to interpret Rabbi Yehuda's halacha of min b'mino eno bata, as it impacts on the question of a mixture between between basar shchuta and basar nevela, as to whether or not it's metame. And the machlokas is as follows. According to Rab Chanina, it all depends on the minority, whereas according to Rav Chizda, it all depends on the majority. So we'll flesh this out as we go through the Gemara. Toshma. Now we're talking about matzah, which was prepared for Pesach, and yet there was a mixture of tavlin, of spices. And generally speaking, the tavlin would be the minority, would be the mute, and the flour of the matzah would be the majority, would be the rov. So therefore, tivla v'ketzach b'shum shemina b'chol mini tavlin kshera. So he added into the dough, when he was baking the matzahs, a mixture of various kinds of spices, and the Bryce establishes that nevertheless the dough can be baked as matzah with the mixture of the spices, and it's kosher for the mitzvah of matzah. And why is that? Because matzah, it still remains with the status of matzah, el shenikres matzah mitubelis. We call it spiced matzah, but it still remains matzah. Kosal kedaitach, the apish la tavlin tfei mi matzah. The Gemara in Havamina thinks that the tavlin is the majority. Notice he really added a great deal of spices into the dough. And yet there's no bittul. Now this works out according to Rav Chanina. Let's understand why. Bishlem b'lamanti omer basar batel azlinon. Right, everything depends on the batel. Batel means, as opposed to the mevatel is the majority, the batel is the smaller volume. And according to Rabbi Chanina, in his explanation of Rabbi Yehuda of min b'mino, if the batel is going to be the determining factor of min b'mino, which means we have to ask the question as to whether or not the batel could actually take on the form of the mavatel, and then and only then it becomes min bimino. Like, for example, getting back to the archetypal case of Rabbi Yehuda that we discussed here on the previous daf, when there was a mixture of basar shchuta, basar nevela, according to Reb Chanina, if the basar nevela could become tahar, like the shchuta, then since the basar nevela is the miut, it's the batel, not the mavatel, therefore we look at that batel, that minority, and we determine whether it could become mino, like similar to the mavatel, and in this case it can, because the Gemara says that the basar nevela could spoil with the passage of time, and then the halacha is that the tumah is parcha, the tumah goes away, and then it becomes like shchuta. So that very potential of making the of transforming, if you will, the batel, which means here the nevela, to become like the mavatel, like the shchuta, that makes it into min b'mino, and there's no bittul. Now, in the case of spices, there's no way under the heavens that the spices could become matzah. Just one second. Let me just make sure I have the cheshbon right, the calculation. So again, bishleim l'man omer basar batel. As linon. So again, according to Reb Chanina, as we just discussed at great length, everything depends upon the batel. And the question is whether or not the batel, which we said in this case, was the matzah, and right because the majority was the spices, he added a great deal of spices. So then the batel havi kimevatel. Dilchi mi apsha havile kitavlin. The matzah, which is in the minority, and that's called the batel, could become like the spices, just like you can't eat spices and fulfill the mitzvah of Ba'erev Toklu Matzahs, obviously, because spices is not matzah. You could also undermine the possibility, nullify the possibility that the matzah could be used for matzah if the matzah becomes spoiled. In other words, the matzah will lose with the spoilage its eligibility as matzah, and it becomes exactly like the tavlin on a legal level, not in the actual physical reality, but legally. And therefore, we're going to say that in this case, we have min bimino, and min bimino is not batel, which means that the matzah still retains its status, and the matzah lechud and the spices lechud, you could describe it as spicy matzah, but it still remains matzah, because we're going to activate the principle of Rabbi Yehuda that min bimino lo batel. And since the matzah retains its status as matzah, therefore you could eat it for the mitzvah of matzah and fulfill your mitzvah. According to Rav Chisda, that everything depends upon the mavatel, meaning the majority. So therefore, if, let's say, in the paradigmic case, the basar shchuta was the majority, then according to Rav Chisda's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda, since the basar shchuta could never ever become nevela, no way how, it's already shechted, it's dead. Therefore, it's min b'sheino mino, and it would be batel. And therefore, tavlin mi kahava matzah. Now that we're saying in our premise that the tavlin is the greater amount, which means that the tavlin is the Mavatel, and that Mavatel could never ever become like the matzah, because tavlin could never become like the matzah. Therefore, it becomes min b'sheino mino, and even according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's batel. And if it's batel, then the matzah loses its identity as matzah, and therefore he cannot be yotze. So how could the Brisa say that he can be yotze? And the Gemara answers, Chachamay askinon, to lo apish lo tavlin. We mistakenly assumed that according to the Brisa, the tavlin was in the excess, it was in the majority. That's not so. Normally, you add a little bit of spices to a dough, but you wouldn't add more spices than the dough itself. So therefore, ruba matzahi, the rove here is the matzah. And therefore, if we apply the logic of Rav Chizda within the framework of Rabbi Yehuda, of course, and therefore, basar mevatel as linon, and now the mevatel is the matzah, because the matzah is the mevatel, it is the larger volume, and therefore the matzah could spoil with the passage of time, lose its differentiation from the spices, because legally they're both the same now. Neither of them can be used as matzah's mitzvah, and therefore we're going to apply the principle of Rabbi Yehuda that min b'mino eno batel. Like in the case of the shchuta, which according to Rav Chizda, since the shchuta is the majority and it's the mavatel, and it can never become nevela, therefore it becomes min b'sheno mino, and it's bata. Is daikanami diktani matzahi el shenikres matzah metubeles. The emphasis here on the brisa is matzahi. Matzah means that it's the majority, and therefore it's not batel. It doesn't shed its status as matzah, and he could be yotze shma mina. Kisolik Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana came from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkechinu lebnei Rabbi Chia diyasvi v'kamar, and he encountered Rabbi Chia, and they were learning a sugya of Menachos. And what was the sugya about? Isaron shechaloko. In other words, a mincha has to be made up of an isaron, and they split the isaron into two halves. And now we start today's daf. Binicho bebisa. Bisa is the basin in which they do the blila, and they mix together the flour and the oil. And now, nagat fulyon bi'echamehem. So these two halves of an isaron in one single bisa, in one single kli, do not touch each other. And the tful yom, who's tameh, came in contact with half of the isaron, but he did not touch the other half of the isaron. Mahu. How do we understand this halacha? Meaning, is there what's called tziruf kli? Tziruf kli means that two things that are in the same vessel are united and become like one, and therefore it's as if the tful yom came in contact with both halves of the isaron. And ki tanan, when it says in the Mishnah, and this is a Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, that kli mitzarif mashe b'tocho lekodesh, that if you have two items that are put into the same kli, lekodesh, meaning as far as the laws of tumah v'tara that affect anything that's kodesh, so the Mishnah therefore postulates kli mitzaref, hani mili hecha dinogi ba'adodi. Shall we assume that the Mishnah would stipulate the following condition, that if the two items that are together in the sharing the same vessel touch each other, then the tumah spreads throughout. Aval hecha delo nagi ba'adodi, lo. according to this first side in the Gemara's vacillation, if there was no Nagia between the two items and one of them was tummy, the other was not tummy, then that which was tummy is tummy. That which did not come in contact with tumah remains tar. Oh, dilma lo shna. Or should we say that the power of the kli to combine those two items that are within the kli is so strong that even a tful yom, and we'll explain that a tful yom is a lower level of tumah, if he comes in contact with one of the two items in the kli, in this case, half of an isaron, it spreads and contaminates as the other half of the isaron, which is in the same kli, as if it had come in direct contact with, as if he, I should say, came in direct contact with the second isaron. That's the Gemara's suffix. Now, let's just point out that the reason why the Gemara here vacillates about a tful yom and not, let's say, a tamei mes or other kinds of tmeim. And the reason for that is because other tmeim, if they come in contact with X, whatever it is, let's say half an isaron, and that half an isaron is sitting in a kli, so the half an isaron becomes what's called a rishon l'tuma, and it not transfers, but it contagiously affects the other half, the kli itself. I'm not sure if I mentioned that, right? So let me go over that one more time. So let's say if a tummy mess would come in contact with half an isaron in a kli, then the half isaron in the kli becomes a rishon l'tuma. It now extends its tuma to the kli itself, which becomes a sheni l'tuma, and then the other half of the saron, even though it didn't touch the tummy mess, but nevertheless it contracts the tuma of a shlishi by virtue of the fact that it's in contact with the kli. But in the case of a tful yom, his status is such that he's only metame that which he comes in direct contact with, but the kli itself, which is holding that half an isaron that he touched, does not become tameh. And therefore the second half of the isaron that's in the kli would not become tameh unless we apply the principle of tziruf kli. Amalahu, so now that Reb Chia presented this suffix, so now Rav Kahana responds to the Bnei Reb Chia, Ihu. Ihu means Rav Kahana. Mi tnan kli mechaber, kli mitzaref tnan, koldehu. Let's be medayik in the language of the Brisa, of the language of the Mishnah actually. Does the Mishnah say kli mechaber, which sounds like there's a touching between one half and the other? No, that's not what it says. It says kli mitzaref tnan, koldehu, meaning in any situation that there are two items within the same kli, then we apply the principle of kli mitzaref. And therefore, since the tful yom came in contact with half of the saron, the other half of the saron was not touched by the tful yom, but nevertheless, since there's a din of tziruf kli, they are like one and the same, and the tumah is now contracted even by that half of the saron that didn't touch the tful yom. Now we get to another question. Hoshit echad lebeinehem. What happens if you have two halves of an isaron inside a kli, and then somebody comes along and adds a third half of an isaron, a third clump of fine flour, and it came from a different karban mincha, and he places that third half of an isaron in the middle between the two halves of the isaron. Now both halves of the isaron of tameh, because we just finished the first question of the Bnei Reb Chia, namely that there is tziruf kli. But Ma'u, do we say that these two half isarons now contaminate the third half of isaron? Amalahu, no. Tzorich lekli kli mitzarfo. Tzorich lekli ain't tzorich lekli ain't kli mitzarfo. The power and the efficacy of a kli to generate this chibur, this tziruf, is only because those two things are meant to be placed in the kli. But now you have a half an isar from a different mincha, which has no business being here in this kli, and therefore there's no din of kli mitzarif. Third question. Hoshit tful yom es etzbo b'neim. This is a question about avir. Avir means the airspace. So now the tful yom places his finger in the airspace between the two chatzi esronim. Mao. Should we say that the Aver is Metame? Amalahu Rav Kana simply says, he rejects this whole question. The Torah was Machadish that if a sheretz, for example, falls into a piece of pottery, earthenware, then that's Metame all the contents of the earthenware jug through the Aver. But the Torah never was Machadish any other transmission of Tumah through Aver. Okay, now Rav Kahana takes his turn to ask questions to the Bnei Rav Chia. Bnei Rav Chia hit him with 3 questions, which he answered. Now he wants to present a question to the Bnei Rav Chia. Hadar Iu, he himself, meaning Rav Kahana, boy leminayu, he asks them the following question: Ma'u likmot mizeh al zeh. Rav Kahana, is now confused about this whole concept of tziruf kli. Is it doraisa or is it Rabbanan? Which means that as far as tum is concerned, the Rabbanan instituted the kli mitzarif halacha in order to be machmir and transfer the tuma. Not again, I keep using the wrong word, transfer to. What would be a good word? Like to extend. I'll just use the word extend right now. If you have a better word, let me know. To extend the tumah to include the second half of the sorrow. That's a chumrah. And that's where the Rabbanan institute the chumrah. But it's not a doraisa halacha. But if it's a doraisa halacha, which we're not sure about, then the tziruf kli should allow you to do one kmitza on half of the sorrow, and that kmitza is going to be chal on the other half of the sorrow because they're all one entity. Tzeref doraisa or Rabbanan. If tzeref is the Rabbanan, then it's only a chumrah that the Rabbanan instituted, but it can't help you with a kmitza doraisa. But if it's doraisa, then the tziruf kli would mean that a kometz from half of the saron in the kli could effectuate a heter on the and a kiyum on the other half of the saron. Amrule. So the response to the Bnei Rab Chia was Zulo Shamanu, but Kayotzi Bo Shamanu. We didn't hear that question, but we heard a similar question. Maybe we can make an analogy to Snan. We learned in our Mishnah here on Daf Chav Beis that Shnei Menachos Shelo Nikbetzu V'Nis Arvu Zu B'Zu. You have 2 different Menachos from 2 different people, Reuven and Shimon, that got mixed up together in one kli. Then is it possible to achieve kmitza on both Reuven's isaron and Shimon's isaron? If they're still separated, such that he could do a kmitza here, and he knows that that kmitza is only from the flower of Reuven, and he could do a kmitza here from the flower of Shimon, ksheros. But in lav, if they're so mixed together that he cannot identify that this kmitza is on Reuven and this on Shimon, psulos. Ki yochol likmots miak sheros amai. Hach dema'arev holo noga. I don't get it. How could it be that if he could do a kmitza on each of the halves, meaning each of the menachos, respectively, of Reuven and Shimon, then the ksheros? But what's going on over here? There was no negia, right? In other words, that part of the mixture, which is eligible for kmitza, did not come in contact with the mincha of Shimon, if you follow my point. So, and yet the Mishnah says that the kmitza is kosher. How could it be? It must be the kmitza of one part of a mincha somehow would impact on the other half, even though they're not touching. So we have to assume that Sirif Kli is operating here, and it's a doraisa. Omar Rav says there's no proof. Dilma begushin amachulokin hasuyim kemasrek. Masrek is a comb, and what happens in a comb? You have the teeth of the comb, and then you have the bar that connects all the teeth of the are connected to that one single cone. And in that case, it's a real chibur. They're all, all the teeth of the comb are connected. And maybe in this case, the two menachos are connected in a way that there is something that actually connects the two. Right? There's one part that's separate from the other mincha, and in that part there's enough for a kmitza, but there's also part of the mincha, of each of the two minchas, which are actually connected, and they're touching each other. And that's why the Mishnah says ksheros. My Havila, what's the final conclusion about two menachos in the same kli? Amar Rava Toshma. I'm going to learn it from the following. Desani will into the brisa. Veherim mimenu. Right, the pasuk says v'kumto misolos hamincha umishmana, and the brisa derives from this min hamachubar. That mimenu here is an extra word that can be interpreted as min hamachubar, meaning that he has to take the komets from that which is attached to the flour upon which he's doing the kmitza. Shelo yavi sar mishnei kelim v'yikmots. The brisa says that you can't do a kmitza on two different esronim that are located in two different kelim. Let's be medayik that bekli echad, had they been in one kli dumya de shnei kelim, which means they're not touching each other, and it's similar to shnei kelim, kametz, he could do the kmitza. So therefore we see that kmitza on one part of a mincha will effectuate a heter shirayim on another part of the kmitza in the same kli. Amalei Abaye says to Rava, you have no proof from there. Dilma shnei kelim hechidami. What's the case of two kelim, which is mentioned in the brisa shelo yavi sar b'shnei kelim, kigon kfiza bekaba. Right, you put one vessel inside another vessel. So there's one kli that holds a kfiza, which is 3/4 of a kav, and you put it inside a kli which is larger that could hold a full kav. Now, the inner kli, which is called kfiza, starts to overflow, and therefore part of the mincha in that inner kli, which is called a kfiza, now becomes part of the larger kli because it overflows and it's in the larger kli, which we called a kaba. The afal gav darive me iloi kevan mifsake mechitza de kfiza mitata lo. So the problem here would be that when the contents of the kfiza in the smaller kli overflows, then it becomes linked up with the top of the mincha that's in the larger kli. However, it doesn't matter. The Mishnah is going to establish, the Brisa is going to establish that you can't do the kmitza on the inner kli for the outer kli because there's a wall that's called mafsik mechitza that separates between the flour that's in the kpiza and the flour that's in the kaba. Now let's be medayik. Kli echad dumi d'shnei kelim echidami. What would be a case where they're all in one vessel and it's similar to the case of two kelim? Kigona arivasa shel tarnagolim. Okay, there's a place where they feed the chickens, and it's a vessel that's divided with a very low barrier, right? So what are these two sections? They have one section which is for food for the chickens, another section is water for the chickens. They're in different vessels, and there's a very low barrier between them so that the chickens could go from the food to the water and from the water to the food. The afagav de mesaka mechitza, even though there is a slight mechitza, but hanagia, but there is a touching because the barrier is very, very low. So therefore, says Abaye, in such a case, we see the two menachos as if they were one contiguous mincha, and there is a negia between the two. But in your case, Rava, aval hacha lo nogel klal tiboilach. I still don't have an answer to your question where there's no negia between the two halves. Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now we have another question about two halves of an isaron that are in the same kli. But here we're going to have a tziruf of mayim. Tziruf kli v'chibur mayim mahu. What happens if you have two halves of an isaron that are both in the same kli, and there's a third half of the isaron that's in a third kli, that's in a second kli, not in the same kli with the two halves, but there's water that goes from one kli to the other. Shall we say the ki tanan kli mitzarif masha b'tocho hani gavoy avol dibroi lo? Only those items that are in the same kli can we apply the halacha of tziruf kli, but not to this third half of an ison which is outside the kli. O dilma, shall we say came the mechaber? That since there's a water that's flowing from the second kli to the first kli, or vice versa, that's enough to create a chibur, and therefore the third half of the saram, which is in another kli, is now mitzuraf. It's now linked up to the two in this kli. If you're going to go according to the svara that chibur mayim v'tziruf kli, that since there's a tziruf of mayim, but what happens in a case where one of the half esronos within the kli came in contact, well, not physically, but was connected halachically, legally, to the tumah that's in the half of an isar that's in the third kli. And now the question is, shall we say that half of an isaron that through the chibur to the mayim now becomes tamei? Will it be metame the other half of the isaron that's in that same kli? Kitan, shall we say kli mitzaref? Hani milu dinogam mikavoy avol mibroi lo. So you could say that this siruf, which is effectuated by the water in the second vessel, that's because it's migaboy, right? It actually, through the mayim, it touches that which is inside the vessel. But mibroi, that which is outside the vessel, does not have the power of tziruf kli to transmit tuma. That was the word I think I needed. Transmit. Okay, just occurred to me. I said extend. Okay, to transmit tuma to the other half of the isar. No dumaloshna. Take boy of another suffix. Again, we have a mincha that's divided into two halves. Isar and shecholko v'nitma echem. One half became tamei v'nicha bebisa, and he puts it into a mixing bowl, and together in that mixing bowl you have the other half, and there's no touching between the two. And so far, we said that this tziruf kli, but v'chazar tful yom v'noga bi oso tamei mahu. Okay, now we enter into a gigantic sugya, which has much to do with Tumah V'Tara, and it's Machlok Shin Abai V'Rava about this principle, which is called Savalei Tumah. Tumah. Okay, now we enter into a gigantic sugya, which has much to do with Tumah V'Tara, and it's Machlok Shin Abai V'Rava about this principle, which is called Savalei Tumah. Okay, now we enter into a gigantic sugya, which has much to do with Tumah V'Tara, and it's Machlok Shin Abai V'Rava about this principle, which is called Savalei Tumah. Okay. So what happens then? Half of the Saran came in contact with what's called an avatuma, which is a very high level tumor. And the other half of the Saran was put into the same Kli, but the other half of the Saran only came in contact, I'm sorry, was not touching the half of the Saran that came in contact with a Rishon Latuma or an Avatuma or Rishon Latuma. And now the Tful Yom, which is a lower level of Tuma, came in contact with that same half of an Isaron that, that contracted Tuma through an Avatuma. I just want to see if he calls it an Avatuma. Yeah, he calls it an Avatuma. Now, we want to know whether or not that half of an Isaron that was touched by a Tful Yom, now in addition to the tumor that it contracted from the Avan tumor, now contracts an additional tumor, which is called the tumor of the Tful Yom, which is a lighter kind of tumor. If we apply the principle of Savalo tumor, which means that once that half Visaran was already saturated with tumor by virtue of its contact with an Ava tumor, it doesn't have the ability to be effectuated, to be impacted by a lower level of tumor because it's already savalo, it's already satiated. Olo, or do we say no? Now we're going to add on a second tumor, which is a lower level of tumor, such that now we can apply the principle of tziruf kli. Why? Because again, that first half of an isaron contracted tumor from an ava tumor when it was outside the kli. So that tumor is not going to be transferred over to the second half of the isaron in the kli because they weren't together in the same kli at that time. But now the tful yom comes in contact with that first half that already was tameh, and at that moment in time, they're both halves of the isaron are in the same kli, and now we can apply katsir of kli. Amalei Abaye, Abaye says, Mi amrinon savale tuma. What's your havamina, Rava, to say that there's a principle called savale tuma, and we can't add another tuma, which is a low level of tuma, onto an item that already contracted a higher level of tuma? Tanan, we have a Mishnah in Masechta Kalim. Kalim is a massive Masechta of Mishnayos. If I dream about learning Kalim, I break out into a sweat. Anyway, is sudden Tame. Okay, now what's going on here? We're talking about a Zav. A Zav who had, let's say, X number of Re'ios, two Re'ios, and a third Re'ia, and he slept on a bed, and underneath that bed, there is whatever there is, whatever that item is, that item becomes tummy with what's called tumas medrus. So in this case, there was a sheet, a sadin, that contracted tumas medrus. And now we turn to Daf Chaf Dalid Omid Beis.